Good morning and welcome to Church at Home with Rachael for this Monday, the 30th of August. They are doing work outside of my house, so if you hear a really loud noise, that's because it's the folks working on the roads. This morning, I'd like to talk to you about something that I've been thinking a lot about lately because I've been listening to a woman named Brene Brown, and she talks about a lot about shame and vulnerability and accepting ourselves and being who we are called to be. And I got thinking about some things she said about vulnerability and how a lot of people, men in particular, get kind of weird about that word vulnerability, being vulnerable. It's almost like there's something shameful to be vulnerable, and that's a shame in and of itself. But what she talks about is the fact that to be vulnerable takes courage. And if you think about it, when are people courageous? When do they have to show courage? When you show courage, you're probably doing something that you're not necessarily trained to do, or something that's causing you to step out of your comfort zone, something that's calling out of you responses that you don't normally use. Otherwise, it wouldn't be courageous. You're doing something that puts you at risk. You're doing something that makes you work from a place that you normally wouldn't. That's being courageous. Well, if we are doing that, if we're working from a place we don't normally work from, if we're putting ourselves out there, and that we might use our courage, it also means we've made ourselves vulnerable. We are accessing or working from a place where we could be hurt, where we are opening ourselves up to outside influences that require us to be courageous. But it also makes us vulnerable. And I think what she tries to say, in my own limited understanding of what she's saying, is that vulnerability is a necessity in life, but it's not something to be ashamed of. There is no shame in being vulnerable. It doesn't mean you are weak. It actually means you're very strong, because you're allowing yourself to venture into some place where you don't hold all the cards, where you don't know the automatic outcome, where you're not sure what's going to happen, and yet you take that chance. That's being vulnerable. So whether being vulnerable with your spouse or maybe a new person in your life, a young man or young woman, sort of in the beginning of a new relationship, and you start to open yourself up and recognize that you're making yourself vulnerable, that you could be hurt by this other person, but at the same time, look at the risk of being hurt is balanced then by the risk of falling in love. The possibility of something wonderful happening outweighs the possibility of something bad happening, we hope. And that's becoming vulnerable. I think that we need to reclaim that, especially, maybe I'm wrong, maybe things have changed, but I think especially the men in our society, the boys, recognizing that being vulnerable is not a bad thing. It's not a shameful thing. As a matter of fact, it's a very, very mature thing to be vulnerable, to allow yourself to become vulnerable. When we look around us and we see the people in our lives, the people in our society who are role models, who are they? Well, first of all, there's sports people. And we've just sort of gotten through the Olympics, and I think right now the Paralympics are ongoing. If we think about that, think about all of those people. Every time you line up, every time Andre DeGrasse lines up on the start line for a race, he is vulnerable. He is vulnerable to getting hurt if people get jostled. He's vulnerable to his own reaction speeds if he's not faster than everybody else. He's vulnerable because there's no guarantee he will win. And then he has to face what happens if he doesn't. But that allows him to be more courageous. It allows him to be that much more maturing, and because in putting himself out there, he then pushes himself even more, and he's more able to grow and become the person he is called to become. And as we saw at the Olympics, he did just that. He didn't win gold in every event that he participated in, but he gave a gold medal effort in every event he was in. He gave the best he had to give every time he put his fingers on that start line and pushed off and started to run. He made himself vulnerable. Look at our politicians. Now, that may just make you laugh, following up from Friday's call to laughter, thinking about our politicians. But regardless of whether or not you like them and what they're doing, they make themselves incredibly vulnerable when they put themselves out there and say, you know what, I believe I'm called to lead this nation or this community or this province, because we are brutal on our politicians. If anybody exposes themselves to being hurt in public, it is our politicians, because we even have people who are paid to dig up dirt, to look deep and try to defame people. And you know what? I don't care where they end up. The first time they run, the first time some person, man or woman, says, you know what, I believe that we need to stand up for us in our society, we need to do this or that, I think they do it out of the right reasons. Now, they may become tarnished or, they may become corrupt, hopefully not, as time goes on. But I think that first little while, when they put themselves out there and really take a chance, they make themselves vulnerable and they make their families vulnerable as well. Who else do we see in our world who can be a good role model, who makes themselves vulnerable? For Christians, there's an obvious one, Jesus himself. If there was anyone who was vulnerable in the history of all of humanity, it was Jesus. Jesus did not succumb to lying when he was challenged by others. He didn't run away and hide in a dark corner when people came after him or challenged him. We see time and again in the Gospels that Jesus was challenged. Everything he said, somebody had an opinion or something, they were trying to trip him up, and yet he was consistent in his courage, in opening up his vulnerability to show the world what God had in store. And isn't that incredible? Jesus was so vulnerable, he went to the cross. And the fact is, he didn't do anything himself to deserve that cross. He did that for us. Jesus made himself so vulnerable that he went to the cross for us. And if Jesus could do it on our behalf, then aren't we then called also to allow ourselves to learn how to be vulnerable, to allow ourselves to try new things, to love even if we might get hurt, to learn things even if it's difficult to learn, even if we don't want to learn those things? Allowing ourselves to become vulnerable means that we are living a courageous life. And if we are living a courageous life, then we are living the life that God has called us to live. And that is the best response that we can have to the gift that Jesus gave us on the cross, in the gift of his complete and utter sacrifice of vulnerability. So as we raise up our children, especially our young men, let's encourage them to be vulnerable. Let's take away the stigma of showing vulnerability so that we might show the world the greatness that can come when we are vulnerable and open to risk, because it is in the greatest risks taken that the greatest successes, the greatest outcomes, the greatest love can be seen. And we have evidence of that in Jesus Christ himself. Have a great day. Open yourselves up to vulnerability and be careful when talking to others that you don't shun theirs. We don't want anyone to feel ashamed of allowing themselves to trust enough to be vulnerable. God bless. Have a great day.